must be done to stop it.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. And today, we're going to dive into the hallways of grace and explain the monsters, their meaning, and the story. So let's dive into it. Also, quickly before we dive into this, I know Superderplux made a video on this, and whilst I will say some similar stuff to him, I will offer a different take on the monsters and the story than he explained. I do advise that you watch his video after this one, as you can get a different perspective as to what the monsters could mean, and maybe get a different perspective also with the lore. And without further ado, let's get into it. When entering Grace, we are introduced with a warning, and entering the game, we are in a strange area. Around us are a series of vault doors that we can enter, and upon doing so, we are thrust into the game. In the world of Grace, you are caught between life and death, trapped in a purgatory crafted by a higher power, a god who made this place, and with it, a path to his presence. But the road to salvation is not a straight one. Along the way, you will face monstrous manifestations of your sins, doubts, and fears. These monsters, made by the higher power that had put you in this purgatory, are not simply obstacles, but they are trials. Each one represents a deeper part of your story, and you must confront them in order to transcend your past and reach the divine, for he has made the path that you must follow should you choose to go with him. Beginning our journey, we enter the hallways to begin our path to salvation. Above us is a star and a physical representation of the higher power, always staring down at us from above. As we open the doors, we are thrusted into the start of our journey and able to encounter the sins of our past. To begin, let's talk about God, or rather, the God of the Grace universe. This guy. And upon dying, there are a series of texts that will appear wherein it is confirmed that this guy, this I being, had created us, that he loves us, and that he gave us free will. With this, we can safely assume that this is indeed God. And one of the texts is interesting. He made the path that will lead him to us, giving the setting of the hallways a significance as a path to him, one that will require sacrifice, endurance, and time. However, as I mentioned previously, trials abound, and those are in the manifestation of monsters. Within Grace, there are currently 7 monsters, as it is currently, I believe, in pre-alpha or an alpha. Each of them are appearing after reaching a certain number of doors. Beginning with the first monster as encountered by us is
Ruin has found you at last.
the Carnation is the first and is the flower of God as mentioned by Superderplux, and is a reminder to the player of the sacrifice of God. Now, considering that this game uses a lot of Christian significance, I mean, it literally has a cross in the thumbnail, this being the first enemy makes sense. The Carnation represents divine sacrifice, considering that within the Bible itself, which is an inspiration to the game, it is mentioned as the flowers that appear most closely to the crucifixion of Jesus, which we take as divine sacrifice, as Jesus is forgiving us of our sins. This is translated as God quite literally sacrificing himself again by allowing you to enter the hallways and into salvation. Also, the idea of it also representing motherly love could also be a representation of this God's love to you, once again offering salvation, much like the divine sacrifice, creating the path for you to go on. It is also interesting that that Carnation is most closely symbolized to the apple and Eve, as the badge that you get upon surviving Carnation is Jablon, Polish for apples. We can assume then that this is likely a reference to the original sin of humanity, being the eating of the apple and into temptation. Being also the first monster that you have and that you must face could also be a reference to the idea that this is the very first sin that was committed by humanity, and as such, it is the very first monster you must confront in this purgatory. It could be assumed that the eye within its petals could reflect God's all-seeing gaze. You cannot escape it, and as such, the most you can do is simply hide from it in order to survive. It's fairly easy to avoid as well, as it has pink tentacles and to be an indicator that it's approaching, and in the hallways there will always be hiding spots where you can evade it, showing this eye and God does not want us to die, and by trusting its path you will be safe. Moving on to the second monster, let's talk about Slight.
An unforeseen complication.
Slight is an interesting monster in Grace, and it takes the form of a strange eye. The mechanics with it is to just simply not look at it, but it is unique in the fact that it doesn't outright end your run, as the first time you do, it doesn't end your run but partially blinds you for the remainder of it, occasionally making statements such as "you're worthless" or "I'm inside." It's unique for these interactions that it has with you, but it also reveals a deeper story. This is a theory, but I think that Slight represents the character's own self-hatred and doubt, and how by looking at it, you are blinded by it. It's also interesting how being blinded does not look like you got partially blinded, but actually looks like this, what you see on screen right now, with darkness covering your face, obscuring your vision. And the game where eyes are a huge motif, the fact that it covers them in darkness could represent you being overcome with the negative thoughts it tells you and the doubt you feel to going through salvation. In terms of story, if you look at Slight, your vision is clouded by these negative thoughts, telling you that you're worthless and that he's inside. echoing your own inner turmoil. This creature represents the feelings of unworthiness that plague your soul, the doubts about whether or not you actually deserve grace, and whether you can ever be truly forgiven. Moving on to the next monster as we go deeper into the hallways, Slugfish.
The harvest is here. Pity those with a place at the table.
Slugfish, like the Carnation, will put tentacles all over the side of the screen in order to signal that it is coming. However, different from Carnation, you cannot hide from it, but it will attack the middle of the path leading to the door, consuming everything in its way. It is a horrifying creature that represents greed, as stated by the badge upon surviving it, and gluttony. In life, this monster symbolizes the unchecked desires that have consumed the player, the hunger that devoured everything in its path. It could be assumed that story-wise, our character was doing the same. It was consumed by greed and had no limit. And now, this manifestation of greed and gluttony walks these halls, the Slugfish forcing you to confront that hunger. And for that, you must learn patience, rejecting the urge to open another door in sight and instead wait for it to happen first. Likely within our character's life, unchecked greed led to destruction, and now you are given an opportunity to face the consequences of your actions. Thankfully, we make it to the safe zone, and upon making it to the next safe zone, you are treated with 2 new enemies instead of the occasional one. These 2 new enemies are Heed and Elkman.
Obsessions on shrinking days. Focus to a fault.
Heed is the opposite from Slight, and his design is as well. Unlike Slight, which makes you look away from him, Heed demands that you stare him down, facing it directly. Heed is interesting mechanics-wise. He will do the same as Slight, but also is the only one that can kinda be combated. Instead of you running away from it, you have to face it down. Story-wise, I think it highlights that Heed is likely the character's fears and anxieties. Perhaps the idea that you can view them and remember them can in of themselves cloud his own visions, like Slight does literally, and so you must face them head on, look them in the eye, and prove that you are stronger than the terror that they fester within you. I think Heed is a trial to represent courage and resolve, and it is likely that the character had difficulty with it when living, hence why he was placed here. Alongside the implementation of Heed is Elkman. Wherein Heed is an odd change of Slight, Elkman is completely an oddity compared to all the rest. When looking in the render of the game, and even in-game, it's kind of difficult to place where its eyes are. You mean to tell me that that white thing is its eyes? Come on. What's weirder are its mechanics. It guards the door and we must hide from it in order for it to disappear, and if we just don't do that and instead get close to it will melt us. The idea of it being an elk is a little bit odd, and even Superderplux struggle to define its significance as a sin. But in my opinion, and as a theory, I think Elkman is a representation of perhaps a fallen angel. Its true form is very difficult to see in-game, and it is shrouded by darkness, as it is a being that should not be seen by mortal eyes. Its presence is overwhelming, and getting too close results in us melting. For this, I believe that Elkman has at least some angelic themes. It being a fallen angel could be that it is quite literally a force that is meant to deter you and prevent you from finding grace. Because of this, it is less representative of the character himself, but perhaps the monsters that do not want you to get to God, perhaps blocking you from that path, deterring you from it. This will make sense with another one that we'll mention later, but before we get into that one, let's talk about the last 2 that we will find currently in the game, Sorrow and Dozer.
Remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.
Starting off with Sorrow, Sorrow takes the form of blood rain that must be avoided or else you will meet a game over. Within the story, I think Sorrow represents the character's grief and suffering. As you hide from the blood that falls, you are reminded of the emotional pain and sorrow that has weighed you down. This is not just grief over loss, it is the grief of your past actions and sins, and the judgment that comes from facing your own mistakes. Next is Dozer, and Dozer is once again a little weird. Dozer takes the form of a smiley face that has its eyes closed initially, until they are open, to which you must crouch and remain still until it disappears. While Superderplux says that Dozer is sloth, I do not believe that, and I instead theorize that he is pride. This is because his badge description that you get upon surviving the encounter with him states, "Swallow your ego or he will." And unlike other monsters, Dozer doesn't attack you or chase you. Instead, he simply watches. Its eyes remain closed at first, but once he opens them, you have to crouch and remain still, unable to act or move on. This act of opening its eyes could be seen as a form of judgment like all the rest, and it's even more accentuated with what happens if you do move with his eyes when his eyes are open, because you will meet a game over, but Dozer will say this: will you wake up tomorrow? And this could be interpreted as the judgment of your own ego. By allowing your pride to control you and ignoring the warning that God gave you on paper and Dozer giving you by having his eyes closed, you've trapped yourself in a cycle of self-destruction, perhaps unwilling to change and not waking up to the reality of your own flaws. Simply put, if you do not humble yourself and face your flaws, you will remain stuck, unable to move forward or find redemption. For this, I believe that Dozer is a symbolism for pride. Whilst all of these can be argued to be placed by the God entity in this game, one seems to stand out the most, that being the Goat Man.
The worst kind of parasite. Opportunists.
The Goat Man is seen very rarely, but it can be indicated by the timer at the bottom of your screen. Upon exiting your first vault, the save zones, you are given 2 minutes and 30 seconds to get to the other vault. He will give you some time before the timer runs out, as the screen becomes saturated and he approaches. He can be flashed away and held at bay for a while, but the only way to beat him is to enter the vaults. Story-wise, the Goat Man is, I believe, the ultimate antagonist in Grace, representing temptation and rebellion, and is a representation of the devil. The Goat Man appears when you are not at a safe house or a vault, and the fact that when the timer tells you to hide now, by ignoring it and rebelling against what God is quite literally telling you to do, you will meet an end. It is also important to note that the only way to counter him is via entering a vault, as God still allows you free will in this place, which he mentions when you die. He also allows the Goat Man to enter this realm, as you can choose not to follow God's path, and instead just wait for the Goat Man to take you. Hence, the Goat Man is an invitation for sin and tempts you to stray away from the path God has laid before you. His presence tempts you to reject the divine order and choose an easier, selfish route. But in doing so, you betray the path that was made for you, and you end the game. It's also interesting that by flashing him, you are temporarily stunning temptation. You are able to keep yourself in control and keep on the path, representing that your character can fight temptation, at least for a little while, by flashing him, with the inevitable being that you must eventually reach a safe house and hide for the time being. Whilst there's not a lot of content yet beyond the monsters and the setting, every monster is a trial and a reflection of your actions, a suffering that you must endure to get to the eye that keeps saving you. Our character and the story is pretty complex. Our character was once a prideful, greedy, and gluttonous individual, but also one who faced misery and grief because of it and in his own life as he lived. It is unknown when our character came to regret his actions, but it's clear that they wanted to make a change. And now God has put them on a literal test, being the journey and the path, in order to redeem themselves and meet God. And that all starts essentially in the beginning, wherein the flower of God is coming after you and kind of pushing you to keep going in order to reveal your past sins and later entities that are trying to block you from getting to God. Grace is a game that ultimately showcases that the ability to endure and fight on despite all the temptation and all your struggles and sins, you have to take them on in order to get to God. And with that, that is Grace, the story explained. I will go on to mention that, by the way, this game is also very much in early access and many more things will probably change. So at least for now, this is Grace, the story explained, with some theories along with the monsters. Thank you so much for watching. Also, go watch Superderplux's video, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.